The Carrot Poker music can only mean one thing. It's time again, my poker friends, for another episode of the Carrot Poker Podcast. And this week we're continuing our foray into Carrot Corner. And we're going to be looking at some of the hands, probably one or two to be honest, posted by some of my students in the last few days. We're going to kick off with a hand from one of my guy I've been coaching for quite some time now actually, who's been going through somewhat of a downswing and has posted some hands as a kind of sanity check, which is always a good thing to do. I think whenever we're running into a lot of negative variance, it can be quite easy to become deluded, and that's basically due to long-term emotional infringement upon our logical thought process. Now, as variance gets worse and it becomes relentless and we feel like there's no escape, we tend to change the way in which we perceive the game, and this can mean making changes to our thought process that we're not even aware of, that are kind of subconscious mechanisms that we deploy to perhaps try to avoid further losses. Like in life, if we're having a bad time with things and constantly one or two actions that we take are leading to negative consequences, like if you go one route home from work every day and there's always like annoying kids like throwing stuff at you in that route, you'd probably like end up taking another route home from work. So I mean, we're very used to just making constant adaptations to our habits in order to avoid like negative things. The problem is in poker that oftentimes there's nothing wrong with the habits at all, and it is literally just variance going through a bad streak, but nevertheless this can lead to lots of problems basically, and that the emotional brain kind of interferes with the logical brain and tries to protect it from things that don't actually exist, that were nothing but a result of variance. And this is why when students are running bad for a certain amount of time, that we're actually, it kind of forces us to be more introspective and take a look at our game and ask ourselves, have we made changes that we don't even know about that have led to us? Just like things that used to be concrete, things that used to be really good habits that were taught to us by our coach or whatever, and that we've deployed to good effectiveness in the past, have they started to change and mutate into kind of emotionally created defensive constructs that are actually have no place in the logic of poker in the cold light of day? So that's the kind of introspection that this student's been doing, and this hand starts with him saying, hey guys, got a hand with a few different spots where I'm not sure what the highest EV play is. So this is good, questioning EV, not just in one street, not just obsessing over like the one spot where you lost the money, like the one call that led to the majority of the money going in. That would be far too results orientated. But rather than that, just looking at common spots that come up all the time, looking at spots that were before the main part of the hand. And it would be even more awesome if I could say for sure that this was like a winning hand where the student actually won the pot, because that would be really cool. It would show that the student, was able to step outside of results and objectively just question his play, even in hands where he did well, and that enforces the very healthy habit in the poker mind that the result of a hand is completely irrelevant to the analysis of the play. Now, I don't know whether the student won or lost this hand, so I can't say for sure, but I always like to think that my students do post hands that they win that are tough spots, as well as hands where they lost and are questioning all their losses. However, one thing I will do with students who are running bad is look at the biggest losing hands, because those are the hands that trouble them, those are the hands that are keeping them awake at night and that are causing this emotional deviation from the logical thought process that used to be their steady game. These are the hands that cause the fragility and the breakdown of their strong game and turn it into something else. And so those are the hands I do look at when we do kind of reviews. But when you're doing day-to-day reviews, not in a coaching session, you definitely want to pick a mix of winning and losing hands. If for no other reason, then simply to enforce in your head that you need to completely disregard results when assessing your play, and that a hand you played well could very easily lose you money, just as a hand you played badly but won the next time or the times after that or in 1,000 times could lose you a lot of money over the long term. So that's definitely a good idea. Okay, so let's get into this hand. So we have queens and we are in the small blind. And Under the Gun opens, this is a 10 no limit game. Under the Gun opens at 2.5x, which is probably a little bit small, to be honest, in 10NL, especially where people don't like 3-bet early position opens wide. Like, I don't even open to 2.5x Under the Gun in 50NL, 100NL, because like there's not so much 3-betting going on that I need to protect my range in that way. I'm going to get loads of multi-way pots. I don't really want that. Under the Gun, you have a range that's got a lot of hands that are wanting to thin the field because they typically are what I call GPP, or good pair potential hands in the Grounder's Manual. And these are hands that thrive being heads up or 3-way, and hopefully not 4-way or 5-way, because flopping top pair is very likely to win you the pot most of the time, but not when there are 4 other people in the hand. So I much prefer 3x here unless the table is nitty and aggressive. But anyway, so the button calls under the guns open, and hero is in the small blind with Queen of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds. So hero goes ahead and squeezes to $1.10, which I think is decent sizing, like it's a bit more than 4x. I think that's fine here. Do we know anything about the players? Let's just take a little look. So Villain, so under the gun is 28-26, so has like a very kind of wide likely opening range. RFI of 16 from under the gun though, so that's not super high, so maybe just like opens wider in later position, but that's fine. We still definitely want to squeeze pre and hero rights here. I think this is a clear squeeze with under the gun being such an active player, even from EP. I don't want this hand going multi-way out of position without the initiative. Big blind cold calls a 3-bet. Yeah, I mean, I think in a vacuum all those factors make a lot of sense, and I think it's also fine, like given how many other hands you want to squeeze here, that you need to have like enough hands that you're squeezing and shoving against the 4-bet, and queens needs to be in that part of your sub-range there. Depends how you want to play. Maybe you want to have a flatting range actually, given that Villain's under the gun, but queens should continue certainly to a 4-bet, probably by a flat, along with everything else. I don't know if I'd have a jamming range in this situation as a balanced strategy, maybe as an exploitative strategy. If I thought Villain was really nutted, you know, I'd go ahead and actually shove like my aces and expect to run into ace king and kings all the time, but whatever. Not super important here. I think a squeeze and then continuing to a 4-bet is certainly the way I would play the spot. Yeah, you don't want to play the hand like the student says, like out of position 3-way, like giving everyone great implied odds when you have a hand that is reasonably far ahead when people call your squeeze. And can continue to 4-bets due to how well it does against 4-bet bluffs. Okay, so on the flop of 7-3-4, before we get to the flop actually, what happens is that Big Blind, who is the main villain in this hand, which will give us a clue as to how the hand is likely to play out later, he's 17-17 over 24 hands, which tells us nothing other than he's probably a regular player and not a fish, which is quite important here, I must admit. Because if a fish cold calls here, you'd give him a much wider range. Like the fish just wants to see the flop with pocket sevens, just can't fold like king jack to only 3 bets before the flop, whatever. But the reg here should have a fairly snug range. I would estimate that he probably doesn't have aces and kings that often in this population, so I am going to discount those. However, I do think that this is a spot in which Big Blind should neglect to have a 4-bet range because there's just so few things he wants to 4-bet for value. Like kings plus is the limit, even if that's good. Like kings might even be a dubious 4-bet in this kind of situation where ranges all look on the stronger side and perceived ranges most importantly look on the stronger side. So I think the best strategy, and the one indeed that I recommend in the Grinder's Manual in chapter 11 facing 3-bets, is to have just an uncapped flatting range when you're facing this kind of 3-bet cold from early position. Like you just don't really want to have a 4-betting range in this spot, and a lot of people don't even have a 4-bet range like under the gun against small blind when they're facing a 3-bet there. So certainly when it's cold to us, I think it's very reasonable to just flat everything we're playing. However, there is it's very important to state the obvious difference here between what is the theoretically recommended play in the Grinder's Manual and what is actually what people do at 10NL. And I think that people do auto 4-bet aces the vast majority of the time, do 4-bet kings a similar but not quite as large amount, and do have a calling range here of ace, king, queens, jacks, tens, nines, ace, queen suited, almost kind of exclusively if they're a tighter reg. So I think we can put someone on a pretty narrow range here. Maybe the bottom parts of it would be ace, queen suited, ace, queen off, ace, jack suited, king, queen suited, maybe tens, nines if we're being kind of lenient with that, but the range could even be more snug. It could even be like ace, king, queens, jacks or something like that. I've seen players who play in that kind of way. So let's give them a pretty tight range. So on the flop of 7-3-4, this is an extremely awesome flop for us regarding Big Blind. The button also calls here, by the way, and the under the gun opener actually goes ahead and folds. I mean, he had quite a wide range anyway, so that's not really such a surprise. So we go 3-way here, the button is called again, and on the flop of 7-3-4, hero bets 210 into 355. Now, I would just be a bit more conscious of sizing here, just based on how much is left behind, and it seems to me that this is what I'd call a 2-street game, that when we bet flop, we're going to be shoving turn, because if we bet flop for 210, there's only going to be like 820, no, it's going to be less than that, it's going to be like 690 left behind, and the pot will be like 775, so I guess that's okay actually, you don't need to go much bigger than that, that's fine. I misread the turn action there, so that's fine, yeah, 210, like you can even go a tiny bit less, into 355 as a c-bet, that's good, it sets up a turn shove, which is what we want to do here. we don't really have the room to bet 3 times and get money in that way without pot committing on the turn anyway, so we're not going to bother with that line. Doesn't really make any sense. Just allows people to float us more on the flop and turn, or possibly even ascertain things like that we don't have a bluffing range, or I don't know, it's just there's no real reason to adopt a weird sizing like that pot commits a street. Pot commits us on one street yet leaves money for the next street. So we bet 210 and big blind calls on the flop and button folds. So we get to the turn, which is a 5 of clubs. And now, given the range that we put the reggae looking big blind on, it's very fair to say here that we're just super happy with what our equity is usually going to be like with queens at that point. We said that ace king was in there, that could float flop. We said that queens, jacks and tens were certainly the hands we expected to see the most frequently. We discounted aces or kings, although it's becoming more obvious now why it's probably sensible for a big blind to have those hands in his cold calling range in this situation pre-flop, because now he gets this turn with this horribly vulnerable capped range of like tens and jacks and nines, and it's just not going to be a happy world for him to have to play that range. It's so vulnerable on the flop, it can be outdrawn just from the flop to the turn quite easily. There are 6 outs against it almost all the time, and even when, you know, the turn comes quote unquote safe, like the 5 of clubs that comes down here and the board's now 7, 3, 4, 5, those hands are still like not very happy, I would think, about just stacking off. So Hero bets 444 into 775. Now he leaves like 251 behind here. There's just no real reason to do this. I don't think it really loses anything. I don't think it makes much of a difference to EV, but why not just shove the rest in? You know, just be consistent with what you would do when you're bluffing. You might be giving away something here completely inadvertently without even realizing. Like, it's possible that you would just shove as a bluff. I think it's quite likely, actually. And so when you make this size for value, it could be the case that you just give away that you don't have a bluff here to someone who knows anything about your game or has noted this in the past, and it's very unlikely that you will get exploited for this or people will realise what's going on. I take that point, 100% agree with that point. However, why take the risk? What's the point in setting up 2 different sizes with different parts of your range where they achieve exactly the same thing yet give away information? It's just a free roll to misery. It's a free roll to being less high EV. There's no point in doing it. So I would just shove here with everything. I don't think there's anything to gain at all by betting like almost all in but not all in. Unless Villain's a fish and you're trying to manipulate him into like calling down wider, that could be okay, but it doesn't appear that that's the case, so let's not give away info. Okay, so Villain then shoves for the last 251, and at this point it really is just a null point whether or not we call, because, I mean, clearly we have to call. There's just nothing else to say here. Like, we're getting like 1 billion to 1. We didn't bet most of the pot on the turn. Most of the remaining stacks, like, needing like 8% equity to call off the rest or whatever, probably a bit more than 8, but needing hardly any equity to call off the rest. We are going to call the 251 having bet 444. Absolutely, certainly we are going to do that. So the question then is, like, is it okay to actually bet flop and turn until you're all in as a strategy here with queens? And I think absolutely it is okay, because the Villain's range is, because of the population read that people don't uncap their range sufficiently pre-flop, his range probably just doesn't contain kings plus very often. He shouldn't really be flopping sets unless he's a fish. If he was the kind of player that would cold call anything that contained a 6 at all pre-flop, or anything that would make a set or 2 pair here, then he wouldn't really be 17-17 over like 20 hands. He'd be far more likely to have stats like 53-30 or something like that. So we just really can't be fearing any hands that beat us here. I think that you just have to shove the turn, because when you've created the stack size where you've got a pot size bet left, it's just, even if there's a question as to whether Villain calls off with worse hands, like, he only needs to do that like 30% of the time for this to be better than check folding, assuming that, well, I don't know, maybe check folding could be better if he's going to check back to the river, but it's just, there aren't enough better hands in Villain's range pre-flop based on our population reads for me to want to check fold queens here. I just think it's terrible, and I think people will shove jacks and tens sometimes, so that would be a catastrophe to check fold turn against those hands. It just really wouldn't be good at all. So I think what's going on here for the most part is that we are looking at a range of mainly 9s, 10s and jacks and queens, the one combo of queens, with some aces and kings thrown in there, and occasionally, sure, there'll be like pocket 6s that had no business flatting and Villain turns out to be a weaker player, but you can't live your life in fear of those things. You need to stick to your solid fundamentals here. So when you question this hand, I'd say the fact that this hand is being questioned is somewhat of an indication that there's a lot of uncertainty creeping in about the way that Hero is playing, and that's obviously based on the downswing that's going on and all of these things, and that's what line check is for. It's to reassure that this is fine and this is just part of your standard thought process. So overall, I'm really happy with the way Heroes played this hand, I think that the sizing on the turn is a bit unnecessary. Why not just shove? But if there's some kind of meta reason for that against villain, or some idea that the population is more likely to stack off to smaller sizing, then fair enough, it's not a big deal either way. I just don't like it if it's unbalanced and you actually shove a bluff, but do this with a value hand. And you should bluff that turn as well, by the way, against a reg, because they should be able to fold jacks and tens a good amount of the time. Like, I'd expect to have reasonable fold equity, and I wouldn't want to be so unbalanced I was just always value shoving the turn. So I would use like ace king as a bluff there probably, because it does block the hands I'm most afraid of. Or maybe like king queen, actually, something with a queen in it. At that point you want to block queens and kings probably. I'm less concerned about aces, like I said. I just don't think they're that big a part of his range. So leave jacks and tens unblocked, use king queen as a bluff here, and block kings and queens when you bluff. And that's a good way to sort of control your frequencies. If you did all your king queen, assuming you've got king queen offsuit and suited here, that would be 16 combos of bluffs. And then your value combos would be your queens plus, maybe jacks plus, I suppose. Although jacks is kind of going into like check fold territory now, probably. Even queens plus would be 18 to 16. That's not a bad ratio given that your ace king combos can suck out when called. So I think that that's a good strategy, is to bluff king queens here and to just shove for value with queens plus. I think that's fine. So let's have a look at Hero's thoughts. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend you there, Hero, by calling you villain. That would imply that we are batting for opposite teams, which is not the case as I'm coaching you. Let's call you Hero, and we'll call the big blind villain. So I want to know what he says now, and why do I care? I mean, I've just told you guys how to play the hand, how he can improve. Why do we care about the big spiel that he's written here? Should we just ignore it? Absolutely not. That'd be a huge category. That would be a huge error, like a massive mistake as a coach for me to do that. It would basically be to say that the only thing that matters in you improving is your play and the buttons you press, and not the thoughts that actually lead to those. It would be a categorical error. It would not be a fair thing to do, and that's why we encourage people to be thorough with their descriptions of the thought process, both in game and out of game, so they can compare that, and they can also compare their out of game thoughts to the critique they get from the rest of the moderators, from me, and from the rest of the students who are learning on Carrot Corner, the community that these hands are all from, which is the community you join or can join for a fee, but do join automatically if you buy coaching from me. More about that in a minute. So basically, let's go through the turn reasoning here. So Hero says, here is where I'm not sure what my turn strategy should be. It's fairly strong for villain to flat my flop c-bet, sure, in the sense that he should have like mainly a pair here. I agree with that. 3-way on the flop, cold called 3-bet pot. But he could easily have 8-8 to jack-jack. Yeah, sure. 8s and 9s, discounted more. Jacks and 10s, very likely. Other combo of queens, very likely. All likely pairs that could call my pre-flop 3-bet and wouldn't likely be 4-betting. So again, I think Hero seems to share the population read that people 4-bet kings and aces here, regardless of whether or not they should. And it's something I'd urge Hero and the other listeners to think about. Should you actually do that here? I don't think so. He can have sets also. Most likely 7-7. I think that's pessimistic. Like, if you've been running into a lot of sets recently, then, you know, you're going to think that way. And that could be another symptom of monsters under the bed. Like, for someone who's 17-17, when you're not even deep with them, to say of them they can have sets on 7, 3, 4, 5, that makes the assumption that they are bad enough to cold call a 3-bet big blind versus small blind versus under the gun with like some random pocket pair. And it's not just a 3-bet, it's an 11 big blind squeeze, which is really big and just leaves no real room for a set money. You can't just cold call 10.5 or 11. You can't cold call 10 big blinds like he's doing here. Your investment, your risk-reward ratio for implied odds is horrendous. Like, you're not going to make enough money when you flop your set. You're not even always going to stack someone. It's just really bad. So let's just give the average 10NL rig a bit more credit than that and say that they probably don't have 7s, 3s, or 4s. Maybe 7s is possible, but I discount it severely, and I would say that 3s, 4s, and 5s are just like almost certainly not going to be in most ranges there. So I think that's a bit pessimistic, and probably a good thing that we've identified that, because it points out the kind of pessimism that does follow running bad and not having good results or whatever. So, turn reasoning goes on, and this is where we really learn what's going on in Hero's mind and learn what's gone wrong after the downswing. Like, by looking at the play, we could say there's nothing wrong with you, but when we do a further examination of the thought process, now we find a bunch of problems, and that's why the thought process is imperative when we post a hand, because we miss the problems otherwise. Like, yeah, that hand's fine, but you don't know why it's fine, you're not likely to repeat it again, it's just useless to say that. So, a line check needs to be a thought check and not just an action check. So, he goes on to say, He can have sets, most likely 7-7, as calling a 3-bet with 3-3 or 4-4 is less likely, but definitely possible as a pure set main. I mean, it's very unlikely, I would say. I would be more optimistic there. I'm really torn as to what my best plan is on the turn. I can fire the second barrel and hope to get called by the 8-8 to Jack-Jack portion of his range, and probably fold out any overcard combos that he decided to float with, or I can check. I think it would have to be a check call as we are way too high in our range to check fold the turn. Yeah, like exploitatively you don't want to check fold the turn there, that's totally true. But check calling just makes no sense at all because villain is very likely to call off again with like jacks or something. It can easily happen, but I think he's quite likely to also check back sometimes when we check. And I'm not saying he'll always check back, because if that was the case we could probably check fold if he always checked back a worse hand. We don't know that, but we do know that he probably... all likelihood is that statistically he checks more often with jacks and tens than he does like any other hand, and so if he does bet turn, I think you're kind of skewing his range more towards those hands that we don't want to see. So check call kind of manipulates things against us when money goes in. It's not a good way for us to put money into the pot, whereas betting is fine because he should be calling wider than he's betting here with hands like jacks, tens, queens specifically. Now I know we chop with queens, but it's still a decent outcome when he has queens here relative to him having kings or aces. By checking the turn, we risk giving free cards to overcard combos that peel to flop. This is another problem. Like, this pot is huge now. There's very little money left behind, so protection is actually like pretty valuable. Like, to just give away a free card to ace king here and give it a free roll to beat us on the river is kind of disastrous. And he could still have ace king certainly, so I think that's another very good argument for betting the turn. It's just the protection of the equity that we do have. But we also allow the bluff portion of his range to stab. Hero continues, rather than just to fold to our second barrel. Sure, but I don't think he really has many bluffs. Like, what is he actually floating? You block ace queen, and is he really likely to call the flop three-way with ace queen on 7-3-4 against a fairly large c-bet? I don't think so. No, I just think it's very unlikely. Ace king, well, that has showdown value. I mean, it doesn't even need to bluff the turn. It could just check back, assuming we're not really folding like jacks or queens or tens or something. We might be. We might not even squeeze tens pre, actually. Hero goes on to say, weighing the pros and cons, I think betting the turn again is probably the highest EV play. Would you guys agree? Yeah, definitely. You don't have another option, so good job. Overall, I'm really happy with Hero's reasoning there. I think he's a little pessimistic about how often he wins, but I think that overall, like, that's correct. Like, weighing up, checking, and seeing the disadvantages. But one disadvantage Hero didn't write about is the one where you skew villain's betting range to be stronger than the range that would have called your shove on the turn, and that's like a big thing here. He goes on to say, as played, I did bet and got raised. I mean, your bet sizing is unnecessary. Like I say, if you just shoved, you don't even have this kind of annoying decision point. Like, this decision point is just so easily avoidable, and it's not like you could ever fold, but it feels really gross, and it hurts your mental game to have to call off the rest here. It just feels disgusting. You need 14% to call. Hero says here he's worked it out. Obviously, I haven't, so I'm going to take that at face value that is the required equity, 14%. Would you guys think calling is better than folding? Of course. Hero says, I doubt he does this with Jack, Jack, or 10-10 all that often, but he will do it sometimes. I mean, he's not just... Like, the thing is, you can't expect Jacks and 10s to just always call the turn with that tiny amount left over. Like, villain is going to realise, like you should have realised, that when you bet that size, you're just completely pot committed, like you have realised in hindsight. Like, you're completely pot committed, and it just makes no sense to call turn fold river. So villain is not going to, like, risk giving you a free roll to like shut down on a bluff when you've got ace queen or whatever. He's going to shove the rest in with jacks and tens the majority of the time that he actually doesn't fold, and that's a big if he's a solid player. I would be tempted to fold jacks and tens on the turn, because honestly I wouldn't call flop with much worse than like a few combos of ace king with a backdoor tens, jacks, queens, kings and aces, so I'd be very happy probably folding the majority of my tens and jacks on the turn, I think, and especially against the population who won't be bluffing too much here, I'd probably just fold all of it. But honestly, yeah, I mean, the decision of whether you call is not even that interesting. It's kind of just not something we really care about, because it has to be a call. So he goes on to say, I suppose the decision to play for stacks or just fold needs to happen on the turn, ? Yeah, absolutely. So good job. He's worked this out. It's a very good poker essay that he's written on this hand. It shows that there's been a lot of thought, and there's been a lot of realization of things that he probably wasn't even considering at all at the time. And it just shows you the massive difference between in-game thoughts and out-of-game thoughts. And that's why we need to work hard as poker players to bridge that gap between what we're capable of doing in analysis and what we're capable of doing when we've got the time pressures and monetary pressures of poker decision making in real time. So, as with either line, betting or check calling, there will only be about a 7th pot size bet left. The more I think about it, the more it seems like there just wasn't much getting away from this hand. This seems like now the results are being given. Maybe Hero won this hand, but when you put it that way, I think you're telling people that we lost, and I think I would just personally prefer to avoid that. It will skew the feedback that you get, basically, so don't even bother saying that. Just say, I think we have to call here, and just leave it at that. Maybe you won. Although, certainly, when you make the small bet and then get shoved on, I feel less good about it, and it hurts my mental game a little bit, so I just like to avoid that in shove turn. So, that is the end of the hand analysis. I think Hero did a very good job of analysing this hand and playing this hand, actually, and just very solid work that will help his game lots, so very well done. And, just because you weren't thinking these things in-game doesn't mean that you never will. The more you do out-of-game work, the more you'll be able to think in-game to the same level eventually as well. So this has been Characters for the Carrot Poker Podcast. Hope you enjoyed this episode. More hands from the corner and other stuff probably coming your way pretty soon. Like I said to you before, to get into Carrot Corner, the most direct way is the most common way, I should say, is to just get a coaching package and then work with me for 5, 10, 25 lessons. The more you buy, the better the value. I'm offering very good value right now in a 25 lesson package. Go over to my website, carrotcorner.com/coaching packages if you want to just see my packages and pricing, and feel free, please do get in touch at admin@carrotcorner.com if you've got any questions about the podcast, feedback, suggestions, anything about coaching, or you're looking to hire me as a coach. This is where I advertise. I do this podcast so that I can advertise to you guys, and so I can hear from you what you want from me. So if you guys weren't going to get in touch with me either for coaching or for feedback, I wouldn't bother doing this podcast. So please do don't hesitate to get in touch if there's something that you'd like to say to me. Admin@carrotcorner.com, and I look forward to hearing from you guys and bringing you more content in the future. I've just started wrapping up the podcast again before I got the outro music ready. I'm always guilty of that these days, but hey, I think we're good to go now. So see you on the next one. Run good at the tables, and please continue to get in touch with me. Thanks for watching, listening.